intimidated by our next speaker. I'm intimidated by his book, not actually by reading the book, by reading the reviews of the book, which is what most of us do. By the way, the bookstore down there is very good. Your book is there, so it makes it a very good bookstore. And you should really spend time looking through it. There's really wonderful books in it. Anyway, Ray is another one of those, I mean, he's slight, but he has a big head, and I hope he talks a little bit about his vision of what might happen or anything else that's on his mind. RKurzwei.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here at my first TED conference. It's a very unique conference. Richard wouldn't tell me what he wanted me to talk about, which is, I think, why it works so well. I was chatting with Bob Metcalf at the party yesterday, and he said, well, why don't you tell him about your next book, which is called The Singularity is Near. So I'm going to try to describe that concept, but we'll see how far I get before Richard walks in my direction, and it's time for me to wrap up. But I thought I'd start by just sharing some off-the-cuff reactions to some of the other things that have been said. I found Meredith's presentation very informative. I didn't realize all of the negative off-puts to some of the surplus projections. Meredith didn't articulate the other side, which is, I mean, she shared the bad news. The good news, in my view, is that the growth rates are going to be a lot more than are in those projections. The growth rates are under 2% for the next 10 years, which is a lot less than we've seen. In the book I wrote in the 80s, I projected continuous and escalating growth through the 90s, which is what we've seen. In the Age of Spiritual Machines, my current book, I project that we'll continue to see that. Growth rates now are dramatically higher than are projected in these forecasts. So my view, the surplus is going to dramatically grow unless we revise the tax code. When things are going poorly, people look for someone to blame, and when things are going well, we look for someone to credit. So everybody thinks Greenspan is a genius, and maybe he is, but if I looked at his comments last week, and I didn't see recognition of what I think is really going on, which is very strong deflationary pressures. I mean, computers are getting dramatically cheaper and more powerful by extraordinary amounts. It's what I call the law of accelerating returns, which is kind of a broader generalization of Moore's law. Software also, I was chatting with Janet Baker, who's here somewhere, a couple hours ago. Both her company and mine, in fact, the two leading speech recognition companies were both founded in Newton, Massachusetts, within a couple of weeks of each other in 1982. But we used to sell kind of questionable speech recognition for $5,000 or $10,000, and now have dramatically better speech recognition for $50. So hardware and software have gone down tremendously in price. It's extraordinary deflation. And the other important issue is that everything is becoming, to one extent or another, and at one speed or another, part of the computer industry. Or at least the computer industry is greatly transforming the business models in almost every industry. And I mean, book selling or making graphic arts or making movies, I mean, these are all becoming, I would view it as aspects of the computer industry, or at least they're certainly profoundly transformed by the computer industry. So if you have fantastic deflation in the computer industry and that's kind of taking over the economy, that's a very strong deflationary force, which is why there is no indication of inflation. The last figures showed wholesale prices going down in the last period. Anyway, Horace mentioned, I'm just kind of flaming here, but Horace mentioned that the increase in the lifespan has been growing. We added a few days a year 100, 150 years ago. We're now adding a third of a year every year. Within 10 years, the biotech revolution is going to add more than a year every year to human life expectancy. So my kids aren't going to have very natural limits to their lifespan. Those of you in my generation have to at least get to that biotech revolution the old-fashioned way. So I talk about the three bridges to immortality, the first bridge being what's debated in USA Today, which is nutrition and lifestyle, and the second being the biotech revolution, and the third being the nanotech revolution, artificial intelligence, where we'll be able to rebuild our bodies and brains using self-replicating nanotechnology. And that's what I'm going to try to segue towards. The other element I thought I'd respond to is Danny's clock, which I think is just a profound statement to actually talk about 10,000 years. And that is hard for me to contemplate when I consider how dramatically the world is going to change in the next 100 years. And in fact, the next 100 years will be 10,000 years. In fact, I actually computed that according to the model that I have, and Hans Moravec and I have been kind of trading formulas, and we're close to reconciling at least our formulas, but we'll see if we can hook up with other people who are trying to project the future. But according to my model, the 21st century will be about 22,000 years long in terms of current rates of progress. One reason that people are way off on future projections, or to put it another way, I mean, it's a common saying that people overestimate what can be done in the short term and underestimate what can be done in the long term. And our projections for the next 12 months tend to be off because we forget details and we're overly optimistic. But in the long term, the reason that people don't, in my view, have compelling and realistic visions of the 21st century, they have what I call an intuitive linear view of the future, which is we assume that the next 10 years, the next 50 years will be 10 years or 50 years of progress at the current pace. Even though people, say at my age, have seen the pace of progress accelerate. 1,000 years ago, a paradigm shift took hundreds of years. 100 years ago, a paradigm shift took some decades. Now paradigm shifts, changes in business models, take just a few years. The whole World Wide Web didn't exist just a few years ago. The pace of change, the amount of time it takes to effect a paradigm shift follows that curve that you saw Bran draw on the board. Progress is accelerating, and in fact, we're about doubling the rate of progress every decade, which means at current rates of change, the 21st century will be about 20,000 years of progress. Now let's talk about how we'll get there. Moore's Law, I mean, I used to ask an audience, who's heard of Moore's Law? And even if I was speaking to a technical audience, 5 or 6 years ago, not that many hands went up. It's not something that the general public is familiar with. But one of the things I thought about in writing my current book is what is Moore's Law? I mean, not literally. I mean, literally, Moore's Law says the transistors shrink. They're not quite this big. But they shrink by 50% every 2 years, so you can put twice as many on a chip, and they run twice as fast, which is a quadrupling of price performance of computing every 2 years, or doubling every year. But what is this an example of? Is this some broader phenomena that's going on here? And so I put 49 representative famous computers, from the computer that's used in the 1890 census to the machine Turing used to crack the Enigma code, up to the machine you bought your nephew for Christmas last winter, on a chart. And it creates a logarithmic, an exponential growth pattern. So the exponential growth of computing has been going on for 100 years through 4 paradigm shifts. We had electromechanical computing, relay-based computers, vacuum tubes, discrete transistors, and integrated circuits. Every time, each paradigm follows an S-curve, and Moore's Law will do the same thing, exponential growth for a while, and then it levels off when you exhaust the capabilities of that paradigm. But there was always another paradigm, that is to say paradigm shift, that took over just when one paradigm ran out of steam. And there was always another paradigm waiting in the wings. When they couldn't shrink vacuum tubes anymore, transistors came along. Now transistors are not just small vacuum tubes, it's a completely different principle. And I was chatting with Andy Grove over lunch over what's going to happen when Moore's Law, the shrinking of transistors on an integrated circuit, runs out of steam. And in my view, the next paradigm will involve the third dimension. Our brain is organized in 3 dimensions. We live in a 3-dimensional world. Why not build circuits in 3 dimensions? And I talk about 5 or 6 paradigms, and we don't yet know which one will work. My favorite is nanotubes, which build circuits in 3 dimensions. It's also interesting to note that this phenomena of exponential growth, another actually interesting issue is when I put the logarithm of the price performance of computing on a chart, it was still an exponential growth. The rate of exponential growth is growing exponentially. We doubled the price performance of computing every 3 years at the beginning of the century, every 2 years in the middle of the century. We're now doubling price performance every 1 year. There's actually exponential growth in the rate of exponential growth. And this phenomena is true of a wide range of technological processes. Genome scanning, for example. When the Genome Project was announced, there were a lot of critics that it was impossible. At the rate at which you could scan the genome, it's going to take 10,000 years. And yet we're finishing the project on time because the speed went up exponentially. Brain scanning, which is important to some of the theses that I express in the book, is growing exponentially. Miniaturization, we're currently shrinking the size of technology by a factor of 5.6 per linear dimension per decade, which will make things like self-replicating nanobots feasible in about 30 years. The rate of paradigm shift also follows an exponential curve. And I have an extensive sort of little institute or research group working on collecting data in diverse areas of technology which show the same, what I call law of accelerating returns, which governs technological processes. So where will this take us? By 2020, $1,000 of computation will equal the 20 million billion calculations per second of the human brain. By 2030, about $1 of computation will equal the processing power of the human brain. By 2050, $1,000 of computation will equal the 10 to the 26th power calculations per second of at least the biological human race. That might be off by a year or two, but the 21st century won't be wanting for raw computing power. Now, raw computing power doesn't necessarily give you human intelligence. It doesn't necessarily give you intelligent behavior at all. You might be able to compute your spreadsheet in a billionth of a second, but how will we achieve the intelligence, the subtlety, the richness, the depth, the knowledge of human intelligence? And without going through it in depth, the answer is to reverse engineer the human brain, which is a process that's well underway. Those areas of the human brain is not one big neural net. It's really hundreds of different regions. They're each organized differently. There are some regions, like the early auditory cortex, which we understand fairly well because it's more accessible to us and from animal experiments. And we've been able to replicate those processes quite accurately. There's some interesting experiments near here at the San Diego Institute for Nonlinear Science where they took an animal brain, selectively actually replaced some of the biological neurons with silicon equivalents based on their model of those neurons. And the whole now hybrid biological, non-biological network worked equivalently, worked the same way, indicating that their model, while not perfect, was reasonably accurate. By 2030, we'll be able to send billions of nanobots, little robots with enough intelligence to take all of the different paths through the brain, through the capillaries. And we have technology today which can scan the human brain. As I mentioned, human brain scanning is accelerating in the resolution, bandwidth, and speed with which we can do that. There's a condemned killer, in fact, allowed his brain to be scanned, and you can access him on the web. We might not want to base our models of human intelligence on that particular scan. It's not high enough resolution anyway. But there's scanning technology today which, if the scanning tip is right near the neural features, can see the neural features with extremely high accuracy and resolution, including all the neurotransmitter concentrations, interneuronal connections, and so on. So this is actually technology we can touch and feel today. We can't make it small enough, but that's where the miniaturization, which if you look at current trends, will be feasible within 30 years to send billions of nanobots through the brain. They take every capillary, they travel therefore by every neural feature, and create a very high resolution scan of the human brain. And then with that information, you can reverse engineer it. That process is not automatic either, but we've shown that when we have actually a picture of certain regions that we do have access to, we can replicate that. Speech recognition, for example, that Janet Baker and I have worked in for the last 20 years, uses models of the types of transformations that take place in the auditory cortex. With that information, we'll be able to get greater insight into our own intelligence, into human dysfunction, understand the algorithms that are behind human intelligence. Ultimately, we'll be able to scan the human brain with enough precision to replicate the personality and memories of a specific individual, which brings up a host of philosophical issues which I won't address. But we'll be able to extend human intelligence using this technology, and I think I'll close on that element. This is not, in my view, an invasion of intelligent machines coming over the horizon to compete with us. If we go back to the same nanobots, we send them into the brain. Another technology that exists today called the neuron transistor allows two-way communication between electronics and neurons, again, non-invasively. This little device, if it's right near a neuron, can detect the neuron firing. So that's communication from the neuron to the electronics. It can also cause the neuron to fire or suppress it from firing, which is communication the other way. And this is technology that exists today. And the era of neural implants already exists. I have a deaf friend who is profoundly deaf, and I can now talk to him on the telephone because of his cochlear implant. They're implants for Parkinson's patients that basically replaces the neurons that are scrambled by that disease. It's feasible because it's a local, for the first 7 or 8 years of that disease, it's a fairly local phenomenon. So we send these nanobots, and they take up key positions in the brain, and they can communicate with our neurons. And all of these nanobots are on a wireless local area network, so they can communicate with each other. And they create new neural networks which can expand human memory. A very simple application would be full immersion virtual reality. The nanobots take up positions by every nerve fiber coming from all of our senses. And then if you want to be in real reality, the nanobots sit there and do nothing. If you want to be in virtual reality, they shut down the signals coming from your real senses, replace them with the signals that you would have experienced or your brain would have received if you were in the virtual environment. And then it will be full immersion virtual reality involving all of the senses. And if I then want to move my hand in front of my face, it would suppress my real hand from moving. It would move my virtual hand. I could see it. I could feel it. You could enter virtual environments with other people, so you can shake hands or have any kind of encounter, from a business meeting to a lecture like this to a sensual encounter in virtual environments. Virtual reality is going to be a place where we spend a lot of time in the 21st century. We don't have to wait for the nanobot-based technology. Just 10 years from now, I believe that computers will disappear. Bill mentioned that they'll be disappearing into our clothing. The displays will be in our eyeglasses and contact lenses, painting images directly on the retina. That's technology that exists today in a crude form. But within 10 years, that'll be highly refined. So you can see a display, if that's what you want, hovering in air, which is something you can do today. Or it can expand to fill your whole visual field. Other devices can detect the motion of your eyes and your head so that you can actually enter a visual virtual reality, and auditory virtual reality is even easier to accomplish. So going to a website will mean entering a virtual reality environment. That's where we're going to spend a lot of our time. That's where we'll interact with each other. Certainly this type of interaction that we're having here, which is not fundamentally tactile, can be accomplished in those kinds of virtual environments. As we go through the second decade of the century, virtual reality environments will become very compelling. Some will be recreations of earthly environments like this room. Others will be fantastic environments that have no earthly counterpart. When we get to 2030, 2040, and we can have virtual reality from within by actually trapping and recreating the signals that come from our senses, then we can enter virtual environments and have really any kind of experience with other people. These, what I call distributed, reversible, non-invasive, programmable neural implants will allow us to actually expand our minds. We're doing that today with invasive implants. There's a whole range of neural implants, electronic devices, which are doing increasingly sophisticated things inside our brains. Now we start with disabled people or people suffering significant medical issues like Parkinson's disease, which is how these technologies start, but there's nothing to prevent these technologies from then going on and enhancing, quote, normal human capability, which in fact has a very broad range. As we go through the 21st century, we'll be encountering and meeting a broad diversity of intelligence. If you meet someone in 2040, a biological person, a lot of the thinking that's going on in their brain, a lot of the activity will be non-biological in nature. Now, if that seems unusual. It's only because the devices that we have met today, the machines, are still 1,000,000 times simpler, order of magnitude, than the human brain. And I don't have time to go through the calculations, but that's why computers today don't have all the endearing qualities that we associate with human intelligence. But as we go through the century, that's going to reverse itself. Because as soon as we go down the road of putting even a little bit of non-biological intelligence or even computation in our brains, and our relationship to technology is becoming more and more intimate, that non-biological portion of our thinking is going to grow exponentially, whereas biological thinking has been fixed at 10 to the 26th power, more or less, for indefinitely, and will remain at that level. By the end of the century, the vast majority of thinking on this planet will be non-biological. And one definition of the singularity, and I don't see Richard walking my direction yet, so I'll be able to get this thought out. We don't have to necessarily replicate all of human intelligence to replicate technical creativity, although I think a strong argument can be made that you do need to replicate the heart of human intelligence. In my view, things like emotion, aesthetic reactions, our reactions to art, our ability to love, sense of humor, getting the joke, is not something stuck onto human intelligence. That's the cutting edge of human intelligence. Those are the kinds of activities that an entity with 100 trillion connections and 100 trillion-fold parallelism, like the human brain, can accomplish. And the notebook computers, which are 1,000,000 times simpler, can't do that. But we will have entities that have that complexity, that richness, that depth, and a lot of it will be derived from the human brain. And there are many examples of how we're going down that path already. When we get to the point where we can have a non-biological entity that can be creative, let's say in a technical capacity, and charged with the mission of, okay, create entities that are even more intelligent and that can think even faster, and then you have those entities, let's say it's just a recreation of the human brain, but instead of using biological circuits, which are wondrous creations, it's amazing that that evolved through natural evolution, but are extremely slow. We calculated 200 calculations per second. There's a 5 millisecond lag in our internal connections. That's 10 million times slower than our electronic circuits today. So if you just run that process using today's conventional circuitry, but with 100 trillion-fold parallelism, you get entities that can think 10 million times faster. And so you put 1,000 non-biological scientists, or 1,000,000 of them, together in a, quote, virtual room, and they interact with each other, and they develop technology operating 10 million times faster than human brains. So an hour is actually, a day is equal to several centuries. What would they come up with? Well, one thing they'll come up with is technology that then can operate 1,000,000,000 times faster than the human brain, and then an hour is equal to a millennium. And that actually is what's necessary to keep that accelerating growth going. Because you get to a point, if you look at the formulas, where paradigm shifts take hours or less, and you say, well, how could that be possible? Humans can't think that fast enough. The answer is that we'll be enhancing our human intelligence through this type of technology. And that's one definition of the singularity, which is near. Thanks.